Welcome back. This is your host, Siris King, and this is going to be another YouTube video. And this was the one that I think people were waiting for, and if you weren't waiting for it, well, this is a continuation of my Gnostic series. And if you weren't waiting for it, when you hear it, and if you really understand it, you're going to probably see that for 90, maybe 95% of people who watch this or listen to this, if you compare it to my Gnostic videos or my Gnostic videos, this is the most important. The reason why I say that is because in Gnosticism, because it's attached to esoteric Christianity, because when you're a spiritual seeker, right? So like if you're in the mainstream, it's funny how this works. If you're in the mainstream, then Gnosticism is probably the safest out of all the alternative spiritual systems, right? So of course it's not Christianity, but if you said I'm a Christian, but I'm practicing an esoteric version of Christianity, people wouldn't come down on you as hard. I mean, Christians might, but in general, they wouldn't. As if you say I do voodoo, I do whatever, Palo, do Obia, I'm into Wicca, I'm a New Age person, I believe in aliens. I mean, even people who say they like yoga, they think yoga is just stretching in asanas. Yoga is a whole other animal other than that, right? So yoga might get a pass too, but for the most part, Gnosticism is a nice, what I would say, not filter, but it's a nice buffer between the mainstream and a lot of spiritual seekers. Now the problem comes in, which could be a big problem, is that when you're a spiritual seeker, because it's perceived that Christianity is, I don't know, I mean, people could have all kind of conspiracies with it. They killed the pagans, they enslaved the Africans, they killed Native Americans. Some people will take that and say, well, I'm not going to be a Christian. And then on top of that, Christians tend to be very anti-spirituality. Like if it's not Christianity, they don't want to hear it. And then when you look at their spiritual practices, when you're a spiritual seeker, it doesn't really match, right? So the problem comes in then is that, okay, well then spiritual seekers go to the other extreme where you can say everything against Christianity, what I just laid out, right? So then when you say esoteric Christian to some people, it's kind of a hard pill to swallow, right? So I mean, even when I first did my Gnostic video a week ago, when I said Jesus is a true king, somebody was like, did he really exist? And in the video I said Gnosticism is flexible as fuck. That's why I love it, right? You don't have to believe he was an actual character, right? You can believe he's a part of you, or not, forget it, but even part of you. That let's say it was a person, but it was just a person who achieved such a level of divinity in the flesh that people looked at him as God, right? And if you're a spiritual seeker and you're into yoga and Buddhism and all kind of other stuff, we know that's possible. I mean, Buddha at one time is very similar, right? Lord Rama was Lord Krishna. Like I think Rama was the perfect avatar. This is not something that's new if you're a spiritual seeker. So Gnosticism kind of doesn't have the same baggage Christianity does, but when you talk about the monad or the God, it's so far away, people can't comprehend it, even if they try, right? They're disassociated with the God that they have been taught, no matter what religion it is, right? We say Christ, some people are gonna love that, some people are gonna hate that, right? Just because in their minds, Christianity has done certain things. But when we talk about Sophia, it's interesting because she's more connected to humanity and the human experience than God, than the monad or the singularity, right? Or Christ. Shit. Or Demerge, really. I mean, Demerge is obviously, impacts your life, but you can't perceive it the way you're supposed to. Sophia is the way to liberate yourself from Demerge in some ways, right? So Sophia becomes something where even in Gnosticism, they say she's part of the human soul. And the concept of Sophia I find fascinating because if you look back, if you look at my ATR series, right, I didn't really mention it there, but the spirits that African traditional religions tend to tap into are really outside the scope of many other cultures outside the continent. And you might get some South American cultures who might understand it. One time Africa, South America were like one place, literally. and people could go into all kind of stuff, but spiritually, no question, Africa and South America connected. So I'm counting them as kind of one land. But in a way, and you know, after saying South America, Central America, Caribbean, all going through Mexico, right? So I'm not counting them. But outside that, yes, those people were able to tap into a spirit, or a spirit of size that other cultures couldn't. This is why in the past, when people used to say, oh, Africans didn't worship gods like the Greeks, they're right, but they're really using more philosophy to say that, right? So they're looking at it from the philosophical point of view, right? Or from the academic point of view, from the intellectual point of view. So, oh yeah, it's not the same. Yes, it's not the same because one God for us, or what you call a God, like whether it's one Orisha, one Loa, one Mopongo, one Abasum, so many other cultures, one Pangu, right? One body, right? So many cultures might say something different, might call it something, one Neteru, right? For if you're into Egypt, one of those things is probably as big as gods of all cultures. Like, let's say a culture has like 7 main gods, probably bigger than all of them, right? And the reason why I mention that is because though Sophia is the most important concept that that you could probably, like, okay, it's probably not good to say what's the most important, because, you know, Christ, you need, as a concept, you need that to liberate yourself. And I think understanding Christ is what gets you into Gnosticism. Maybe that's even the end result when you achieve the Christ body, 8th chakra, and then you become like Christ. But until you become like Christ, that's a better way to explain it. Until you become like Christ himself, which is an 8th chakra being, where you're almost like a new species, right, in the physical flesh. Sophia is by far the most important concept in Gnosticism. And there's many reasons for that. Because where regular Christianity focuses a lot on Adam and Eve and that fall, Sophia and Gnosticism is talking about a higher fall that happened way before that. The fall that the Gnostics are talking about probably happened before Atlantis itself. And we're going to keep it 100, right? And so, because of that, it's a very hard thing to kind of understand to some people, because in some ways, what eventually happens is that we don't really realize that we've been on a wheel for a long time. And what seems like a fall is only a fall when you are in an immature state, right? And what I mean by that is, what seems like the fall is supposed to happen, and eventually we're supposed to get out of it by achieving a higher gnosis. So it's a fall, and it triggers a lot of other falls. So when you go into Adam and Eve, you can perceive it as triggering other falls. You can perceive Adam and Eve as a fall, but when you understand that that's almost kind of the part of the construct for some of us. So meaning, in Gnosticism, they even say, for the most part in the Bible, the Jesus Christ story is allegory. Doesn't mean he didn't exist physically, but that's not something to be argued. That's why I kind of enjoy when I get, you know, I only got one comment on that. I thought it'd be more. When somebody says, prove to me Jesus existed. For Gnostics, we don't have to do that. That's the difference. Like even the Atlantis story, where people say prove that existed, we don't even have to do that, because we can also take it as a symbol. Like I did a video, but it's a long time ago, where Atlantis is a symbol of what if the ancients were running a civilization, hence you get Atlantis, with no opposition. So in Kemet in Egypt, yes, the priests ran Kemet in Egypt, but there was obviously opposition eventually. Even if there wasn't, there were segments of the Kemetite society that may not have been as spiritually mature as the people running the show. Or the people running the show may have been eventually become corrupt. Whichever way you want to explain it. Atlantis was a symbol of that not happening. So when they say Atlantis fell, you know, in a lot of other esoteric schools, they're like, well, yeah, because even such a society could fall, and then it gets back into the Gnostic theory of the merge in the physical world. You have imperfections in this physical world. Or you have parts of the physical world that when the universe is going through certain cycles could be dangerous. So when they say Sophia is, like, I mean, in some ways she's both the hero and the villain, right? Why? In the Gnostic story, she's the female version of God, but she's the lowest eon, right? She's the lowest of all of the eons God created. And not only is she lowest out of all the eons God created, she then wants a bridge between herself and the original singularity. It doesn't work. She falls. She gets lonely. She creates a counterpart, but she does it without, because normally eons like her do it in pairs, right? So they have a male-female counterpart. She did it by herself. Hence, the merge comes in, or Yaldabaoth comes in, boom, we get that. And so, in a sense, because in a lot of people's minds, they perceive Yaldabaoth or the merge as evil, and Sophia is creating them, and Sophia is the one who gave him power, she is both, in a sense, the hero and a reluctant villain. If you want to look at it in that type of, from that type of lens. In truth, it's just a symbol of the fact that she just represents, like I've said this, I don't know which video I said this in, but I've spoke about this where I said, in some ways, when you look very carefully, Sophia is more, she's kind of she's symbolic of the fact that how shall I put this? Personal forces against abstract forces. I forgot which video I said it in, but I said it recently, where abstract forces are more what people consider cosmic. They're more considered like the father. Those are untouchable. Those are the forces that higher initiates and secret societies that are true, not secret societies that are wicked. But I'm not saying wicked, imbalance, right? There's no real, I don't really do wicked or good. I do imbalance. So secret societies that imbalance don't tap into those abstract forces, right? Hence, they're so abstract, you need to be initiated to get into, or to even understand, or to be able to perceive. Sophia is the opposite end. She represents the personal forces that's everywhere, right? And so when we say everywhere, this is how Sophia, in some ways, so like if you're a person who's a pagan, and I don't say that to be bad. I mean, look, I do Obi and Voodoo and fucking Palo Mayombe and shit. Like I do. I'm an ATR guy, so I'm not. When I'm saying it, I'm not even saying it to be me, right? When you're like that, and just the Christian system is just still not your cup of tea. From my experience, Sophia tends to be the one that you can relate to the best. Why? Because Sophia is the one that's closer to us. So she basically is, in some ways, the origin of she's the origin of nature, right? The elements themselves, even the planets. The planets are some of her lowest creations, but they're some of the most influential creations in the physical world, right? So a lot of gods, we look at a lot of cultures, we look at a lot of gods, they usually, the most powerful gods are usually associated like with one of the planets, Mars, Venus, Uranus, Neptune. I know those are kind of far, but Saturn, Mercury. But they usually associate with those planets, or they associate with the elements. Usually, if you're a god that's not an element, that's not associated with the element, not associated with the planets, you're less powerful. So the most powerful gods, or like when we talk about the power number 7 archangels, 7 chakras, 7 sacred metals, 7 African powers, blah 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 blah. 7 sacred colors, ultraviolet system. I mean, yes, she's basically on all that's under her. All that. So the 7 powers, 7 musical notes is all under her. So she influences your physical existence more than anybody. So if somebody didn't like Gnosticism and they were like, fuck it, that's Christianity, I don't believe in that, I don't believe in that, Sophia is the mother. So a lot of people sometimes when they say the woman's God, right? So here's a good example. You get certain circles who say the woman's God. You get certain circles who say the black woman's God, right? And they talk about Sophia. Sophia is the lowest part of the Trinity that you could comprehend. So when you're a person who's not initiated, when you're a person who hasn't went through that spiritual you may have went through a partial spiritual transformation, even though some of these people just repeating what somebody else said. Sophia is going to be the eon that you perceive or sense. So in some ways, when they say she fell, then she went back, because I gave half the story. She fell, but she rose back, right? When she rose back, she has a role where she basically monitors. She's the in between the heavens, the supreme heavens, and our world, right? So you have to go through her, in that sense, and that's symbolic to me, in a sense too, because realistically, the gods of many of our cultures, right? So like, let's say I'm a person. I'm just giving an example. If I'm into the Greek gods, right? Or I'm into Voodoo, I'm into Ifa, Yoruba. She's the origin of all of them, right? All of them. Because if they're connected to an element, if they're connected to a planet, she's in charge of all that, right? Most of these gods are nature spirits. So she gives birth to all of them. She gives birth, in a sense, she's also connected to our soul, what the Christians call the Holy Spirit. She's connected to. So when you're praying and you want your prayers to have energy, you got to invoke the Holy Spirit. You got to call the Holy Spirit to you, in that sense. So even when a Christian says, name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, that's her, in that sense. So she is a truly important concept to understand, because, like I said before in my demerge video, when we deal with especially African Gnosticism, right? We don't have a problem with matter the way the Europeans did. And again, I'm not getting into any Hotep stuff. I'm just calling like I see it, right? And so what eventually happens to sometimes, or to some extent more, is that if you look at it how we look at it, she's not even the villain at all, right? In a way, I mean, for us, the Merge is not even a villain either. It's just that Sophia and the Merge, especially the Merge, you're going to perceive them in negative lights when you first start in the journey, because when you first start in the journey, it may take you many lifetimes to get what you're supposed to get. That's the difference, right? So like if you're a person who says woman is God, black woman is God, or any woman is God, you still have more transforming to go in that sense, because what Gnosticism teaches you is perfect balance. So where the Christians come in and say no, like the Christians in certain pagan societies were kind of two ends of the same coin. With the pagan societies, or the societies that were in the indigenous societies, because some people may not like the word pagan, many of them were pro-woman. Christians, or a lot of a later form, because people say European, but a lot of the early European societies, especially like in certain Scandinavian societies, they were pro nature, pro mother, right? But the later societies, from Rome, and when they conquered the rest of Europe and other parts of the world, Africa, and some parts of the Middle East, they were more masculine, or they were more into a masculine version of God. So Gnosticism, being the balanced system that it is kind of symbolic of both, where they take the best of both worlds, where they're a balanced system in a sense. And what makes Gnosticism interesting is that when you start to really see the Syrian, Egyptian origins of Gnosticism, or not even just origins, but more the intense connection they had. Because like I said before, Gnosticism is older than Fecan civilization. Like I said, it could go beyond Atlantis, right? So that's why when, somebody, person might ask, oh, what mainstream Gnosticism you talking about? Like I say, African Gnosticism, mainstream Gnosticism, many different Gnostic orders, or different paths of Gnosticism. If I say mainstream Gnosticism, the average person is going to understand Gnosticism not from oral tradition, but from books. Part of the problem that exists is that, and I'll probably do a separate video on Gnosticism and esoteric Christianity, because I think this is an important concept to understand. I'm only going to touch a little bit here. If you say Gnosticism is esoteric Christianity, right, and you're saying it's a continuation of Judaism and Kabbalah, right? Hence, that's why you have Gnostic Kabbalah or Christian Kabbalah, right? Which I think understanding Kabbalah, understanding Christian Kabbalah is probably more important than even reading Gnostic texts. I'll tell you the truth. You could actually practice Christian Kabbalah and not even read Gnostic texts. I keep it 100, right? I mean, do I suggest you do that? No, I don't. But I mean, it's important. The tree of life is essential, right? But when you look at it from a certain point, what happens naturally is, in a sense, if you look at it as a continuation of Judaism and Kabbalah, well, what do Judaism and Kabbalah have? Judaism and Kabbalah have oral tradition, right? That's what Christians don't have. Like the regular Christian just takes the Bible and that's all they have for the most part, right? I mean, they have their own kind of oral tradition, but it's not mainstream, and you have to really know what you're doing to actually access that, and it's probably just Catholics and that's it, right? Other Christians like Protestants, and they don't really have that real oral tradition that in Judaism you have. Even Islam you have, right? Then in Islam you have the hadiths, which are what learned men would come in and learned men who's supposed to be holy men. I mean, that's a whole nother story. They come in and they give their own interpretations of certain texts, right? Specifically in the Quran, or certain beliefs that Muslims have. Christians don't have that, right? They don't have that oral tradition, like mainstream oral tradition, right? So what then happens is, if you are a Gnostic, so let's say you're a person who's a Gnostic, who believes you're Gnostic, and you just picking up Gnosticism. You didn't go through the Jewish stage. You didn't go through the Kabbalah stage. You definitely didn't go through the oral tradition stage. That is going to be, you're going to have a different interpretation, and probably an inferior interpretation than somebody who's went through that school. Because that's how I look at Judaism, Christianity, Islam as schools. Kabbalah, Gnosticism, Sufism as schools. Islam is the last one. So it's interesting how most people stay at those two schools. Judaism, Christianity, Gnosticism, Kabbalah. And the last school, because they're coming from the Western mind, they may not feel comfortable with Islam, but that's the last school, but that's an important one, right? And so most people get stuck in all these schools. But think about what I just said though. if you are practicing Gnosticism and you didn't go to the Jewish school, the Kabbalistic school, and even if you went through the Torah and the Old Testament, if you didn't go through the oral tradition, you are still going to have a different interpretation than somebody who's went through that stage, the oral tradition stage, and then after that goes to Christianity and goes to Gnosticism. That's my point of, somebody, I forgot who said it. Somebody said in my channel, I'm gonna get your name. And I know your name. I just can't off the top of my head. I interact with you all the time. I just don't want to say your name wrong. But that individual said Gnosticism is not really organized school. It's kind of like information that popped up individually, and it was so powerful and so profound. People started ending up in different parts of the world saying the same thing. And I even go one step further and say, yeah, people on different planets end up saying the same thing. That's what I mean by mainstream. What I mean by mainstream is if you don't understand that and you're going to quote a book to me and you're going to quote, and because like I said, I'm going to do a separate video on esoteric Christianity and Gnosticism. In some ways they're the same, but there are differences, right? But if you don't understand that, it's hard to make it to the next level. So when you look at Sophia, the reason why she's so important is because Christians will always be locked into the fall of Adam and Eve, and because they're locked into the fall of Adam and Eve, which is the most recent fall, they're always destined to be in a circle where they keep going through the same thing over and over and over again. When you understand, it's not even imbalance. It's a structural thing in the universe where the part that's chaotic is also the part that's liberating. Right, so you have one part which is the cosmic masculine part, which is stable all the time, boom, 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 but hard to access. Shit, motherfucker ain't accessing that easily at all, right? Okay, you ain't getting that, right? And then the Sophia part is the one that's personal. That's what I said. She's the one that everybody listen to this video. Out of all the videos, you might think you want Christ, but she's the one that's the most tangible. She's the Holy Spirit. She's that energy. She's that refined part of Mother Nature herself. That's an important concept to understand in a lot of ways, and that's what she represents. So, in some ways, I look at her as a very interesting piece, because in some ways, it's not an easy thing to get past, right? Where you could stay, like I said, she's the origin of like a lot of your indigenous gods, indigenous forces of nature, forces of the visible universe that you could, like the planets that you could see. She is that. Like, she is that, right? So she's the one where if somebody wants to tell me you come from a different spiritual system, you say F the monad, F the singularity, F Jesus, F the merge, you ain't going to say F Sophia. You may not like the name, right? In Africa, we might say Nana Balaku, right? Mother of the Oases, the Loa, and the Central African forces, right? Whatever. You might have a different name for her, but in the end of the day, that's what it is. And that's why she's the most important. Because in a sense, when I brought up the ATRs and I brought up the size of the spirits, and this is where I'm going to talk about the mainstream Gnosticism now, where they wouldn't understand this either. They can say Sophia, so a mainstream Gnostic, right? A non-African, and I'm saying African. Look, some of you guys in the comments, quoting young fucking tribes, right? Stop. First tribes, the San or Bushmen in South Africa, the Bakata, the Pygmies in Congo and Central Africa. Period. Anybody else other than that is a youngster. Don't come with me in no damn tribes when it comes to this shit, right? And some of you guys are quoting tribes that are really young, to be honest, by African standards. Remember, they're not young by European standards. By African standards, they're young. There's a big time gap between the San, the Koshan, or the Bushman people in South Africa, the Congo people, or the people who in Congo, the Pygmies, Bakata, whatever you know, Bakata, the Baka. When the Egyptians said Baka, the Egyptians were calling them the ancients, right? The Egyptians called the Pygmies the ancients. Those are maybe the two oldest tribes in Africa. You want to come me anybody else? When it comes to this concept of Sophia, which I'm talking about, she's older than Atlantis, think of what you're saying. Don't come to me with that shit, right? That's why I don't answer certain comments. Don't come to me with that. So, she's old as fuck, right? The spirit that she represents, now this is how other ATRs could come in now. The spirits what she represents are big spirits. One of them can be as big as a whole system of gods. So when a Gnostic says, oh, She could be she could be a part of the human soul, but she's the Holy Spirit, but she's a twin of Christ. A European Gnostic, because they don't invoke those type of spirits, is only going to have an intellectual understanding of how big Sophia could be. When you invoke those spirits, when you understand that, let's say in voodoo, Dambala is like a freaking bigger than a galaxy, for God's sake, or Heta Heru in Egypt, when they say she's the Milky Way, they're letting you know how big these spirits are. Huge. Huge. Sophia is like that, maybe bigger. So this is not like a ghost. You see what I'm saying? This is not even like, that's why when you see certain books like the Meta Netta and certain books where they be like, oh, this Neteru, this Orisha is with this planet and blah, blah, blah. This Jupiter means this and Saturn means this. These spirits are so big, they could take on characteristics of all the planets. One of them could take on characteristics of all 7 planets that we can see visually with our visual eyes. So saying that this person's a planet, you couldn't say it, and it wouldn't be totally off, but it's a external level of understanding at best. And Sophia not being understood, her size and scope not being understood, is what I think separates the European Gnostic from the African Gnostic. The African Gnostic, because of the indigenous systems of the continent, has dealt with other spirits that kind of are like that, whereas other cultures haven't. Like I said, I'm saying Africa, I'm including certain South American and Central American populations as well. If you want to go into even certain parts of Melanesia and Oceania, right? Aborigines, Melanesians, I would include them too, right? I keep it black with even outside the continent of Africa. Just saying. So when you understand that, then you understand how other cultures can kind of miss the size of scope of Sophia, and then when they miss the size, they miss the nature of Sophia. In that sense. And when it seems like she's the villain and the hero, she's just not. Like that just represents a personal powers. Personal powers that existed before Adam and Eve, existed before Egypt, definitely existed before Atlantis, right? And because of that personal power, depending on the cycle that you're living in, Dark Ages, you might do wickedness with it. If you're in the Golden Age, you might do good with it. Hence, why you need both hemispheres, like a tree, the masculine, the left side of the tree is feminine, the masculine, the tree of life, the Kabbalistic tree of life. The right side is masculine, you need both. The right side is the one that gave you the stability. So even in the Dark Ages, you take the personal side, the left side of the tree, or left hand path, is a personal thing, but you still use it for balance. And that's what Sophia represents. And Sophia is the bridge, whereas other Gnostic principles people might argue about. If you ain't a Gnostic, if you ain't tapping into, if the highest forces you go on are those 7 planetary powers, and like I said, I can't see how anybody tap into anything higher than that. 7 archangels, 7 African powers, 7 chakras, 7 musical notes, 7 sacred melodies, even in alchemy itself. No, you're all that's Sophia. All that's the Holy Spirit. In that sense. All that's the female animation of God. So she's the one Gnostics know. Even when we're dealing with people who don't believe, we're dealing with people from other systems, they all bow to her. That's the difference. And when you understand that, in a sense, instead of saying you could look at her as she's fallen, but you look at it as, no, the material world still has divinity trapped inside of it, waiting. That's why I said a long time, well, in one of the videos, that's the basis of alchemy. The basis of alchemy is freeing that God particle or that divinity that's in even inanimate objects, definitely in your cells, definitely in nature. You release it, you free it, and that's doing God's work, and that's making earth like heaven. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. That's what that means. So when you say Jesus is Sophia's twin, or he came to free her, it's just symbolic of another eon who's higher than her technically, because she's the lowest eon. And calling it Gnosticism, coming in, showing us how to free her. Not even him freeing her herself. Him showing us how to free that spark within us, that spark within nature. So Sophia, obviously Mother Nature. When people say Mother Nature, when a shaman don't have nothing to do with the Bible, maybe can't even read or write. He's still acknowledging Sophia. The difference is the other part, the male part, he may not understand yet, and hence when Gnosticism comes back in. So Siris King, doing a much needed video on Sophia, that fire. Till next time, peace.